Okay, thank you for tuning in. Tonight, I want to take a brief look at Yizkor. Now, I know my Sephardi listeners might not actually know what this is, but this is a really important topic for my Ashkenazi listeners and viewers. And being that it is Hoshana Rabbah tonight, and we are coming up upon the final day of Yom Tov, the Ashkenazim will be saying this tefillah, the tefillah of Yizkor. And I thought it would be nice to do a brief history of it tonight in about 20 minutes or so, or less, I hope, so that we can know a little bit more about this tefillah, where it came from, who wrote it. And we won't be delving deep into the theology and the history today, but I do want to give you all a sensible background into Yizkar so that you know what you're talking about and you know what you're saying and you know what to say and what not to say. So let's begin with the common origins that you will hear or you'll read about in a siddur. So if you open an Ashkenaz siddur, and if you're Sephardi, you might not know this, you'll see that on the final day of Yom Tov, any Yom Tov, and as also Yom Kippur, there's this section where the men and women who have non-living parents, anyone who's lost a parent or lost somebody significant in their life, will remain in the shul while everyone who doesn't have someone to mourn will leave the shul. And they will recite a short paragraph called Yizkor Elokim. The language is very short. In the Siddur, it's Yizkor Elokim Nishmas Avi Mori Shahalach La'olamo Ba'avur Shani Noder Tzedakah Ba'ado. Hashem should remember my loved one, my departed one, Ploni ben Ploni, on behalf that I shall give tzedakah for him, ubischar zeh, and in this merit, his nafshos tzura b'tzur hachaim im nishmat Avram Yitzchak v'Yaakov sarav karachal v'leah v'im shar hatzedikim tzadkaniyot shebegan Eden. So if you open the Ashkenaz Siddur and you see this short paragraph, you'll wonder why they make such a big deal out of it. And many of the Siddurim will bring a an idea that the Yizkor began its origins in the history of the Crusades. And after the Crusades, when we had so many orphans and loved ones who had lost people, the trauma of the First and Second Crusade uh, brought the communities to create special memorial services for the people who had departed in the First and Second Crusade. And from that, we have the Yizkor liturgy today. And although it's a short paragraph, it is a relic of the Crusades. Now, I want to dispel that myth here once and for all, and that is that we cannot say that with any certainty. While one could argue that the Av Harachamim Tefillah, which was we first found in the 1290s, does come from a post-Crusade era, we have no evidence whatsoever to support that Yizkor comes from the Crusades. All the more so is that we know that Yizkor was originally not a prayer at all. Rather, Yizkor itself was a haphazard um, introduction that was put into something called the Memorbuch. The Memorbuch were essentially Sifrei HaZikaron or Sifrei HaZichronot in Ashkenaz, in the communities in the Rhineland. And essentially, at the beginning of a memorial that was written in these books, you would have a section which would say something like Yizkor Elokim, and then it would list the name of the person. As Nishmasa Isha Hashuva, and they would put a whole entry for that specific person. And that almost what's it called? Arbitrary and very simple introduction to a person's name was Yizkor Elokim. Those were the earliest, that's the earliest time we find in the 1200s, this language of Yizkor Elokim being mentioned. And it originally began as an introduction to the Sefer, to an entry in the Sefer HaZichronot, where you were entering somebody's name who was to be remembered and departed. That's where we first see this language. It did not begin as a liturgy. It began as an introduction to an entry in a memorial book for the community. Now, let's discuss what this memorial book was used for so that we could better understand what these memorbuch or these memorial books, what place they have in the history of Yizkor as a tefillah. So, okay, if you lost me, what I'm trying to say is so far, Yizkor Lakim began, at least the language of this liturgy, began as entries inside a memorial book that a community had. So, in order to unravel this, we have to understand that there were three memorial services that were done by Ashkenazic communities that in the Middle Ages that kind of confused and overlapped each other. And it makes the early history of something like Yizkar kind of complex. We're going to go through them one by one. Number one is something called Haskarat Nishamot. Haskarat Nishamot is where we get the Sifrei HaZichronot from. This custom is very simple. You see, even in the medieval times, in the Middle Ages, the Jewish people in the Rhineland had a firm understanding that doing mitzvos for somebody who is dead, or as a zechus for someone who is dead, as a merit for a departed loved one, is kind of preposterous. To say that, for example, I will put on tefillin for you is preposterous, right? And in the same vein, to say that I will give tzedakah for as a merit for someone who is dead is also preposterous because a person who is dead has finished his time on earth. He no longer has an opportunity to continue doing mitzvos. His time was his time, and it's done now. He can't do any more mitzvos. He can't get any more zechuyos in his lifetime. And therefore, it was firmly understood in Ashkenaz that once you die, your time is up, and there's no more mitzvos or averos that could be attributed to you. That would be preposterous. Your time is your time. And now that you're gone, you can no longer do any mitzvos. However, they figured out a loophole. Listen to this. Let's say you're a millionaire, or you're a wealthy person, or even you're a normal person. You have $10 million in your bank account. Now, during your lifetime, you would never give all of that away. But what about if you wrote in your will that you would give half of it away? It's much easier to depart with your money when you're dead than it is when you're alive. And therefore, a lot of the rich people would take their prized possessions, whether it was money, whether it was a Sefer Torah, whether it was a machzor that the shul could use, and they would donate it to the community upon their death. So the Memor Book, these Sifrei HaZechronot, contained entries for all the donations that that departed people in the community had made towards the community, because this was essentially a great loophole. On the one hand, you were able to get a mitzvah after you die, meaning even though you've died, there's still millions of dollars in a new foundation going towards poor people. And so these, mitzvahs stack up and they're done on your behalf as you agents of your will, and therefore you're still getting mitzvahs when you die. And furthermore, in the communities on special Shabbats, they would recite this Yizkor Elokim in public as a honorific to that person. We don't know which Shabbats. It could have been on the yard site. It could have been during the holidays. There were some great figures like Rashi or Benu Gershom who were mentioned every Shabbat just because, we're going to remember the great scions of our community, Yizkor Elokim. But we don't have any clear data about when they would do these, what do you call it? When they would do these Haskarot, but we do know what it looked like. We have right here in one of these entries here. Let's look together. I'm sorry if there's something blocking it on the screen on YouTube, but here you have an example. Reb Shimshon Bar Asher Haniach Sefer Torah v'Chumash v'Shnei Chatzi Mechzorim v'Shnei Kosot Shel Kesef Lasot Behem Kiddush v'Havdalah. Right, Reb Shimshon, the son of Asher, left the Sefer Torah, a Chumash, and two halves of a Machzorim, 2 volumes really, 2 silver cups to make Kiddush and Havdalah in the Beis HaKnesses, and 10, let's call these litra, basically 10, whatever their currency was, dollars, for the yayin, for the wine of the Kiddush Havdalah, and for the bris milah, and $20 let's call it $2,000 towards teaching the children, and $1,200 for the poor people, etc., etc. These entries where it would begin with the Yizkor Elokim, and you would have an entry person after person after person. This was the minhag of Haskarat Nishamot in the Rhineland, a very important minhag, and not only would they be able to get, would the departed people be able to get what's it called, mitzvos when they were dead, but they would also have an honor in the community when they would be recited on a special Shabbat. Which Shabbat we don't really know, but we could assume it was probably either Yartzeit or sometime when they thought it was suspicious to do so. Next, the next minhag is something called matnat yad. Matnat yad is something they did on the last day of Yom Tov whenever they would read the parasha of Kol Bechor. Why is that? Because the pasuk says as follows. The pasuk says in this reading, Shalosh pamim b'shana, yira'eh kol zechurcha et pnei Hashem Elokecha b'makom asher yivchar b'chag ha'masot u'b'chag ha'shuot u'b'chag ha'sukkot. Right, 3 times a year, all the male citizens should come to Yerushalayim, and lo yira'eh es pnei Hashem rekam, they shall not appear before Hashem empty-handed. Ish k'matanat yado ki berkat Hashem Elokecha asher natan lach. Each should come with his own gift according to the blessing that your God Hashem has bestowed upon you. Ish kematnat yado. Early in Ashkenaz, the Gabayim and the rabbis realized this was a great opportunity. If on the last day of Yom Tov we are reading a parsha which says that nobody should come to the Beis Hamikdash empty-handed, everyone should come with a gift of his hand to the Beis Hamikdash, we should take this as an opportunity to make an appeal on Yom Tov for the needs of the community and for the needs of the Beis HaKnesses. And what they would do is like this. The rabbi would take the Sefer Torah, because Ashkenazim love drama. They would take the Sefer Torah, the rabbi would go person to person in the shul and say a Misha Berach for every single person. So the rabbi would approach you, you'd have to stand up, to attention by a Sefer Torah, and he would say Misha Berach, and he would say your name, and then he would say, he'd give a bracha to you on behalf that you should give matanat yado. You should give you a matana to the basic Knesset bli neder. Fine, and you'd sit down. And it was an opportunity for everybody in the shul to get a bracha on the last day of Yom Tov, from the rabbi himself, and also an opportunity for people to give money and to get the honor of announcing how much money they were going to give for the community. So this was a win-win for everybody. However, this minhag that was done was specifically a zechus for people alive. In the Rhineland and in France, they were very adamant about this. It's Yom Tov. You can't talk about dead people and Haskaras Neshamas on Yom Tov. This is a happy affair. This is just an appeal for money on Yom Tov, and it's going to be a zechus for everybody. And in most communities in Germany and in the Rhineland, they were adamant that this minhag should only be tzedakah for people who were alive, as a zechut for people who were alive. Now, some communities in Italy and scattered around Europe began also collecting money for people as a memory for people who died. And this was met with some resistance because that is not theologically simple. It is actually theologically complicated to give money as a zechus for somebody who had passed away. That just simply doesn't make any sense. He's done his time on earth. Why are you giving money? How can you give money on behalf of somebody who's already departed? That brings us to the last minhag. Remember, I said there was going to be 3. So far, we've mentioned Haskarat Neshamot on special Shabbats, and separately, Matnat Yad. So the Haskarat Neshamot part, that's with the Memorabuchs. That's the Sefer HaZechronot. Then comes Matnat Yad. That's appeals on Yom Tov. The last one is called Poskin Tzedakah, or in the earliest sources, like Maaseh Gaonim, it says Mevarchin Tzedakah on Yom Kippur. This last minhag was the outlier, the exception. One time a year, everybody agreed it was okay to give tzedakah as a memory for those who had departed. You see, Yom Kippur is not as happy as Yom Tov. It doesn't have the same requirements of joy. And therefore, it was seen and understood that we can give we can mention the dead, and not only mention the dead, but also give tzedakah for them as a pidyon for the dead. Now, the Rishonim grapple with exactly how this is possible. Some of them bring a medrash, like Medrash Tanhuma or Medrash Sefri, that the dead also require a kapara. We don't actually have such a medrash. There is practically no good early rabbinic source that it is possible to give a pidyon nefesh for those who are dead. If anything, the Gemaras seem to reject it in many cases. I think there's a Gemara in Harius about this, actually. Regardless, it was accepted at least once a year to do some sort of pidyon, if not as a zechut, but at least as a redemption. It's not a merit, it's more of a redemption for those who are dead. Now, we do know that tzedakah There's a few Gemarot about this that say tzedakah is almost like bringing a korban. So it could be that the learned in the synagogue and the Rabbanim thought that it was a good idea to um what's it called? It was a good idea to collect tzedakah as a pidyon and as a kapara for the people in the community on Yom Kippur, not just those who were alive, but also those who were dead. Now, only, as I said, specific communities would mention the dead also on the Yom Tovim. Most communities only did it on Yom Kippur, but some communities, like the Italians and specific communities in Europe, would still mention the dead by the Matnat Yad on Yom Tov. It was controversial, but some did it. This is from where we get the idea of doing Yizkor, because what happened was that in some communities, especially we have evidence from a community called Regensburg. Eastern Germany, what they called Österreich, had a couple of communities which did things differently than the way they were done in Western or Central Germany. Again, I'm calling it Germany now, but of course it was a a hodgepodge of different provinces and locales, jurisdictions at the time. But essentially, we know that communities like the community in Regensburg would say that instead of the rabbi going from person to person on Yom Tov with the Sefer Torah, that would take way too long. They would just have the rabbi do a Misha Berach in the front, and everybody would say their Yizkor at their seat quietly because it was much simpler. It was just so much easier and saved so much time. Yom Tov's long enough. Second day Yom Tov this year, we have a three day Yom Tov. Yom Tov's long enough, and people are a little bit done in shul. They don't really want to spend that much time, and therefore some communities made everybody do their own Yizkor quietly, while the rabbi would do the Mishaberach out loud, and anybody who would want to give tzedakah would give. Over time, the minhag, for some reason, the minhag of giving tzedakah became less and less common, and it was just the Yizkor, what's it called? The Yizkor memorial service itself, just saying that paragraph quietly, which became the main thing. Even stranger, the communities in the East decided that besides them deciding to say it on your own and to say it individually, they then brought this minhag to the West and Central Germany after Jews started moving back into the central areas of Germany. So in the modern period, in the last 500 years or so, we see the minhag of Matas Yad get evolved into a minhag of just Yizkor, of just the section about Haskaras Neshamas, meaning that originally it was a minority custom, but then suddenly it starts getting transferred to the rest of Germany. So what began as a minhag of Haskarat Neshamot, what began as a minhag of Matnat Yad alone, just an appeal, turned into a minhag of just Yizkor, because the minority of communities who would do Matnat Yad and Yizkor for some reason dropped the appeal altogether. And then it made its way back to the rest of Germany. That's when we have a lot of confusing accounts and confusing reports about exactly how the minhag was practiced. And different locations had different minhagim. But eventually, what ended up happening in the majority of Germany and in the majority of Europe is that the Yizkor section, in other words, that short section to be Maskir Neshamot, became the only part people said on Yom Tov quietly. And before you knew it, people didn't really understand the minhag, since the minhag was so broken from its original source, and because it was divorced from the appeal, which originally was the main part of it, it led to a lot of confusion. Number one, um, walking out by Yizkor. This is a very common minhag that most people who don't have somebody to do Yizkor for will walk out. And nobody really understood why. Many reasons have been given. The first time this was mentioned was in the early 19th century by the Shari Ephraim. He's like, for some reason, everybody walks out by Yizkor, and I have no idea why. Like, I don't know why everybody walks out, and nobody really knows why, but he offers a reason. He says, well, maybe the reason is because we're afraid that the people who still have living parents are going to say the paragraph because they don't understand Hebrew, and they're going to accidentally say that Hashem should remember the soul of my father, and it's going to be an ayin hara for my father. Many other reasons were given as well. But the most convincing one to me is the one that was suggested by Tzvi Ron. And Tzvi Rohn suggests, and this is just one independent scholar who has a bit of a messy but cogent article on on this topic. He suggests that it just comes from the appeal. You realize anybody who didn't have somebody who was departed didn't have any money to give. They weren't going to be donating if there wasn't going to be Lahaskarat Nishamot, right? They only wanted to do a Matanat Yad if it was going to be Lezecher Nishmas. So all the people who didn't plan on giving money were just going to pop out. They're like, okay, 20 minutes of Haskaras Neshamas, there's 20 minutes of Matnat Yad with a Yizkor section at the end. I'm gonna bounce. I don't want to give money. I don't want the rabbi to come to me with a Sefer Torah. I don't want to hear a speech. So they would kish, go to the Kiddush club. And over time, as the minhag, again, it became less and less about the appeals and less and less about the tzedakah giving, eventually people started, this old minhag of people walking out just stuck, and anyone who wasn't going to be doing the Yizkor paragraph left because they had no reason to stay. And that's why that's why originally people began to walk out, and it has nothing to do with ayin hara. It's just a relic of the earliest way that the earliest way that the minhag was practiced. Because of the Kiddush Club, essentially, people started walking out by Yizkar. And eventually, in my opinion, I think it then began to get conflated with superstitions. We have another phenomenon that people who are in the first year of mourning would also walk out um, and not participate and not say Yizkar. And I should just mention that on the screen, I have a picture of where Regensburg is today. It's not properly Austria, but that's also a cutout of what the shul looked like in the 1500s in Regensburg. It's a wood carving. And in Germany, they do their best to preserve the history of the synagogues that were destroyed by the Nazis. So this is from a museum. Anyway, so this was originally a minority custom of people to walk out during the first year because they weren't going to be saying Yiskar. Nobody really knows why. From the early Sidurim, it seems that, again, most people during their first year would say Yiskar, the first year of losing somebody. But some say, well, in the first year, we know from all the hack about Kaddish, we know that, in the first year, the neshama is still undergoing its period of din in Shemayim, and therefore it's inappropriate to do Yizkar. Or some people would say that it was too mournful for Yom Tov. If you had the first, what do you call it? If you had somebody in their first year, they might cry in Yom Tov by when they say Yizkar, so it's not appropriate to keep them in the shul. Regardless, even though Yizkar began as simply a short paragraph, a short recital to be said at the end of an appeal, Yizkar turned into something much more meaningful. Now, anthropologists would be fascinated by this topic, and they are. And essentially, this accidental minhag, which arose in the past 250 years of walking out, has given Yizkar its own some solemnity to it. It's become a very solemn prayer because once you make half the place walk out, everybody feels like, oh, this is a special prayer only said by certain people who are among a certain rank within this group, right? Only the people who are of a specific rank can say this prayer. And it makes Yizkar feel much more solemn than it is. And it used to be much shorter, but over time, there were more and more things added to Yizkar. There's a Kalmale or an Avarachimim added at the end. There's Psukim said as well. And therefore, Yizkar has, you know, uh, born a life of its own. People come to shul specifically for Yizkar. People who don't come to shul all year round will come just for Yizkar because they feel it's their duty to honor or to remember their departed loved one. There might be some element of superstition, what's it called, that is at play here, but at most, I don't think it's just superstition. I really do think that uh, prayers and liturgies that are meaningful don't have to be rooted in some deep Kabbalistic or deep mystical or ancient practice. Prayers that are meaningful, they end up being successful because we discover that they work. We discover that they talk to people, and we discover that congregants, what do you call it? That congregants can relate and they resonate with those rituals. And somehow, Yizkar, even though it wasn't originally a minhag, it's only an evolution of an evolution of much earlier medieval minhagim, which nobody practices anymore, somehow the whole solemnitude and the whole ritual of making people leave and of reciting it quietly by yourself, which also, as I said, is an innovation, became its own kind of ritual that somehow worked and somehow resonated with people. And it was a good way for people to feel like they were doing a duty and they were doing something positive for somebody that they had lost and somebody that they had loved. And while we could go on and on about why each individual person finds that meaningful, clearly it's resonated with a lot of people, and therefore, in the past 250 years, Yizkor has seen a birth into a minhag and a ritual of its own, even though it didn't exist in this form earlier than 250 years ago. Now, one last thing I want to point out before I close this brief history, and that is the psukim, which people say in addition to Yizkar. So there's some people will say Yoshe b'Seder Alyon, but in many Sidurim they will print this list of psukim which begins Hashem ma'adam v'tedaehu ben anosh v'tachsheveu Adam lahevel hema, Adam lahevel dama yamav kitzel over. The reason I want to talk about these psukim, it's like a list of roughly three, six, like 8 psukim, is because I don't believe anybody should be saying them. Because not that chas v'shalom, not that psukim could be treif, but the source of reciting these psukim, in my opinion, is very questionable theologically, especially if your leaning is orthodox. That's to say it in the nicest way possible. Some Orthodox people would cry out that the theologies here are incredibly treif. And so if you are Orthodox, I would caution you against saying these psukim. And why? So the reason is like this. This pictured here is the Hamburg Temple in 1818, I believe. The Hamburg Temple was one of the earliest Reformed congregations, if not the earliest. And it was founded among early enlightened German Jews in the early 1800s. Now, Germany at the time was newly becoming a nationalistic nation. After the defeat of Napoleon in Leipzig in 1813, the multitude of localities in what we would call Germany today, the multitude of provinces began to feel like, like a single people. Like they all spoke Deutsch, they all were part of the same armies that fought off Napoleon, and this national identity, hence the future nationalism of the country, began to be born after the defeat of Napoleon in 1813. And the king ordered a day of liberation, right? A liberation day to celebrate and commemorate this day when the German people were liberated from, the French forces and when they became a nation. And aside from the Day of Liberation, which, by the way, the Hamburg Temple was intentionally opened on Liberation Day in 1818, aside from this declaration of a day of liberation, the king at the time, whose name was, and forgive me, I don't remember it by heart, is King Frederick William III of Prussia. He instituted something for the Protestant churches of Germany, something called Totensonntag, which means Sunday for the dead, along with Totenfeiers, services for the dead. Essentially, he was telling the Protestant churches that we're going to make a special Sunday where we have a Sunday service to remember the fallen soldiers of those battles, and we're going to have special services on that remembrance that Memorial Sunday. We're going to have memorial services. And this was very popular among Protestant churches. And the early Reformed liberal Jews wanted to model that as well, because much of the early liberal modern Jewish liturgy was very much a wannabe Protestant Christian liturgy. They very much wanted to be more enlightened and more current and more modern, and they wanted their liturgies to better reflect the attitudes and zeitgeist of the Protestant Reformed churches. And therefore, the Hamburg Temple created a siddur and a machzor, which also included memorial services, but they replaced the classical Yizkor services with their own memorial service, which was very similar to the way the Protestant churches would do it. Now, in that whole section, which included poetry and meditations. They very much did not believe in Tchias HaMesim. They very much did not believe in, a lot of the classical Jewish eschatology, and they wanted to reject much of it. And therefore, for them, it was much more about the immortality of the soul and meditations on the futility of life and a poem and a hymn and et cetera, et cetera. Now, I won't go through the entire service as it was in the 1800s, but essentially, among those poems and hymns, there were also in that overall message was those list of pisukim, right? Those were brought almost as proof texts for the points that the siddur was trying to make. Now, subsequent siddurim played with that early Hamburg siddur. Some of them, especially the Orthodox or Orthodox adjacent Sidurim, selected those Pesukim as meditations so that for the worshiper when they were about to say Yizkor. However, that selection of Pesukim were originally used as proof texts for the argument that the soul is immortal, but there might not be a Olam Haba, there might not be a Tchias HaMesim, but the soul is still immortal. And maybe they don't believe in Schar B'Einish, but there's still a futility of life that we have to remember and a beauty to life. And I wish I knew more about it. I read a brief article on this by Annette Bokler, and I'm sorry if I'm not doing it justice, but I don't believe that the reform here wanted to stress anything about a Tchiyat HaMeitim or anything like that, and therefore their liturgy and their service included many meditations and hymns. So therefore, these psukim that are added here in the Orthodox Sidurim are essentially recycled from Orthodox and Orthodox adjacent Sidurim, which copied from the Reform Sidurim in a form of competition. Therefore, it is very important that the printers of Sidurim consult with people who understand the history of liturgy and understand the history of the Siddur before they go ahead and print whatever they want. And if I was saying Yizkor, and I don't because I'm Sephardi, and it's never held a very great place of esteem in our hearts. We have Hashkavot, we have Kelmalech, we have plenty of times to do memorial services for the dead, and there's no special one throughout the year for us. But for myself, if I was going to be doing Yizkor as an Ashkenazi, I would omit it simply because its history is simply so questionable, in my opinion. Okay, so thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. K'tiva v'chatima tova. Chatima tova, I should say, and Chag Sameach. Thank you for your attention, and Bezrat Hashem, we will continue in the coming weeks with continuing our shiur on the regular Shemona Esrei.